Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Gatzke, Director of Water Conservation for the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin. I, along with some of my colleagues who you'll meet in just a minute, will be your Lulu Lake tour guides today. This virtual tour is part of a larger celebration of the Nature Conservancy's 60th anniversary. Over the last 60 years, we've protected more than 236,000 acres of Wisconsin's lands and waters. These special places are here for us all to enjoy because people who cared about them took action to protect them. We have so much to be thankful for, so let's celebrate with a virtual tour of the Lulu Lake Preserve. Lulu Lake really is the jewel of the Mukwonago River Watershed, and we can't wait to show it off. But first, a few items to help you participate in today's event. During the webinar, you will not have camera or audio privileges. If you have any comments or technical questions, please direct them to the chat box at the bottom center of your screen. Our moderators are ready to help answer questions. Next to the chat icon is a question bubble. During the question and answer session at the end of the presentation, or during our speakers' remarks, please type any questions you have for our speakers in this question and answer section. We'll try to get to every question, so don't hold back if you're curious. Okay, let's get started with the tour. And just so you know where we're going today, here is our presentation at a glance. I'm going to give you a little introduction about our work in the greater Mukwonago River Watershed, and then we'll get into the virtual tour of Lulu Lake. We'd like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. The Nature Conservancy respectfully acknowledges the earlier inhabitants of the Mukwonago River Watershed as previous custodians of these lands and waters. And we pay our respects to the elders of these peoples, past, present, and future. We acknowledge the continued cultural, social, and spiritual connections of the indigenous peoples who've lived here. The peoples known as the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, Sauk and Fox, Peoria, Kickapoo, and Miami. We recognize the value, the essential and continuing contribution of indigenous peoples to the region, and we do apologize if we missed anyone with this land acknowledgement. So the Nature Conservancy has worked in the Mukwonago River watershed since the mid-80s. We've focused our attention and our resources on the Mukwonago River because of the exceptional freshwater biodiversity and the high-quality wetlands, prairies, and oak savannas that exist here. Many of the rivers in this state might have 20 or 30 fish species, but the Mukwonago has almost 60. There are also several species of fish and mussels found here in the Mukwonago that are considered state or federally rare or endangered, like the northern sunfish and the starhead top minnow that you see here pictured. The reason the system can support so many aquatic species is first of all due to the exceptional water quality, but also the fact that there's both warm and cold water habitat available. Today, our virtual tour will take us to the Lulu Lake Preserve. However, this isn't the only place the Nature Conservancy works in the Mukwonago River watershed. The Nature Conservancy owns and manages about 2,000 acres in the watershed. We've concentrated our protection on the headwaters. That's the highest elevation area in the watershed where the streams begin. We choose to focus on the headwaters because we want to ensure that the rivers and streams that feed into the Mukwonago River are healthy from the start. It's very difficult to improve water quality of a degraded stream, but we can be much more successful if we start with a healthy river and then work to keep it healthy. Freshwater systems are highly integrated. Our rivers and lakes contain inflows of groundwater and also water that started as precipitation falling on the land and then flowing over and just beneath the land surface into our rivers and lakes. That means that the health of a river not only depends on what is happening in that river, but also what's happening on the lands around it in the watershed. That's one of the reasons why we and many of our partners work to protect and restore the prairies, oak savannas, woodlands, and wetlands in this watershed, as well as protecting lake shores and riverbanks. Our work to protect natural habitats ensures that we have healthy water features like Lulu Lake for people to enjoy and interact with nature in all its glory. We're now arriving at the Lulu Lake Preserve, and I'm going to pass it over to Jerry Zeigler to tell you more about the history and our work at the preserve.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Jerry Zeigler. I've been a volunteer and an employee of the Nature Conservancy for about 35 years, mainly working in the Mukwonago River Watershed. The history of the Lulu Lake Preserve tells us a lot about how far we've come in restoring and protecting this important place. Lulu Lake is one of the gems that Nature Conservancy is protecting along the Mukwonago River. It is a diverse, amazingly pristine area, especially considering that Milwaukee is only half an hour or so away by car, and development is approaching from all sides. This is a place of sublime beauty. This is a place where you can catch your breath both mentally and physically, but it is a place that needed a lot of help to start to return to what it once was. And it will continue to need all the help we can give it. Imagine this same place with multi-story buildings, dozens of vehicles, and lots of people coming in and out of buildings. This is what it looked like when the Nature Conservancy entered in an agreement with the property's owners, a pharmaceutical company, to visit the property to discover what plants and animals might be there. This was in about the mid-1980s. And what a surprise. Native Wisconsin orchids, remnants of rare oak openings, and hundreds of other native species were there. Invasive species, unfortunately, were also appearing, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. Construction was underway on a corporate retreat and training center for the pharmaceutical company. And then fortune smiled. In the early 1990s, one company that owned the property merged with another company. That company already had a retreat center, so the merged company decided to sell the property, and TNC was able to buy the first acres of land that would become the Lulu Lake Preserve. And with the purchase came the job of deconstructing the 40,000 square foot concrete building that was already built and then to restore the site. Before that, from about 1960 through 1984, the site was one of the many youth summer camps in the area. There was a cafeteria on the hilltop, a boathouse by the lake, and tennis courts in the flat area just inland from the lake. Elsewhere on the preserve were staff cottages, dormitories, and garages. Even before that, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, a booming ice cutting operation in winter provided jobs for about 150 area people and lots of ice for Milwaukee's breweries and for ice boxes as far south as St. Louis and New Orleans. A huge ice storage building that you can see in the picture sat just off the lake and covered 1.5 acres. Feeding that building was the big ramp you see that was used to take ice from the frozen lake into the building or directly onto rail cars that were backed onto a siding next to the lake. A little steam engine that was nicknamed Billy made the 17-mile run from Eagle to Elkhorn once a day and periodically made a stop to pick up ice on its way back to Eagle. The big ice operation disappeared in the mid-1920s or so when the ramp from the lake to the ice house collapsed, and right about the time that people began to buy electrically powered refrigerators. But you can still see the ghosts of the ice operation, even today. If you paddle your kayak or canoe 100 feet or so off the west shoreline near the boathouse, look down and you will see some of the pilings from the ice operation, their tops still visible a few feet below the surface. All in all, with all of that development, that was a pretty big footprint. Today, all that is left from these three major human ventures are a garage near the entrance to the preserve and a boathouse. After TNC created the Lulu Lake Preserve came the tough task of trying to heal the land. But the land was ready and eagerly responded to the work of staff and volunteers who diligently seeded the scarred landscape. Today, it's tough to see any signs of the development near the lake. Protecting the Mukwonago River involves protecting the uplands, the prairies, and the woodlands at Lulu Lake and upriver of its source. In the last few decades, TNC has planted about 500 acres of land to native prairie and cleared invasive plant species from hundreds of acres of woodlands along the river. There's so much beauty along the Mukwonago River. I like to think of the river as a necklace and these preserves as glittering gems. More than 10 years ago, TNC was fortunate to receive a donation of land that is now the Newell and Ann Meyer Preserve. This preserve on the Walworth-Waukesha County line is important because, as Sarah mentioned, it has the headwaters of the river. This is the place where the river is born. The Meyer Preserve is a place of restored prairies that now are home to bobolinks, the black and yellow bird that you see in the picture, that migrate from South America every year. These birds fly more than 5,000 miles and rest at night. I'm sorry, they fly 5,000 miles at night and then rest during the day. And we've installed bluebird homes for the little guys on the right in the right photo. Then that has helped us to raise more than 100 of their young. And northern harrier hawks perform incredible maneuvers just above the tops of the prairie plants as they swoop and dive to look for food. And those are just a few of the many bird species that have thrived on the Meyer Preserve since the Nature Conservancy began work there. Downstream, the river winds through woodlands at the Crooked Creek Preserve, a place where 70% of the flow in the entire 18-mile river originates from deep springs that pump out millions of gallons of water each day. To the south, the Nature Conservancy works at the largest fen complex in southern Wisconsin at the Pickerel Lake Fen Preserve. The Pickerel Lake fens are home to unusual and sometimes rare species. Many fens disappeared over the last century or so because they were easy to fill in for development. At Pickerel Lake, new fens are continually being found though. And as with the Lulu Lake and Crooked Creek Preserves, the Pickerel Lake Fen Preserve is home to many, many springs. The unnamed creek, can you imagine there's a place that still doesn't have a name? The unnamed creek that comes out of the Pickerel Lake and winds its way downstream to Buell Lake, then drops over a dam into another unnamed stream that feeds back into the Mukwonago River. In the summer track, the little square that you see up above the Lulu Lake Preserve on the map harbors dozens of cold water springs feeding into Eagle Spring Lake. This is the newest addition, and TNC began work here about a year or so ago on the 80-acre site. The big problem on these preserves right now are invasive plant species. Once the worldwide economy began to evolve in the 1800s, lots of plants and animals hitchhiked or were brought to America, some of them on purpose. Garlic mustard came over to America in the 1800s and was used for seasoning. Buckthorn was planted to hold the soil. Honeysuckle was planted because it smelled really nice. And in the 1980s, zebra mussels showed up and multiplied by the millions throughout the Midwest. And those are just a few of the dozens of species that got here unknowingly riding in cargoes from other continents. So what's the problem with these interlopers? Plants that weren't originally here are called non-native, but if they start to spread aggressively, displacing native species, then they are invasive. Honeysuckle and buckthorn are a problem because they block the sunlight, preventing native species from growing. Invasive garlic mustard comes out earlier than native species and blankets the woodland floor, also crowding out the natives. These invaders have no natural enemies and they make prairies and woodlands very inhospitable places, reducing the variety of plants from hundreds to just a few. Some of these invaders also poison the soil, making it difficult for native plants to grow. And once invasives get a foothold, it's really, really difficult to get them under control. It takes time, but at Lulu Lake we've had success. TNC staff and contractors worked for more than 30 years to push back the garlic mustard that had moved into the woodlands. This year, we think we've got finally getting a handle on the garlic mustard of the Lulu Lake Preserve. We'll probably always have to keep an eye on it, but the suppression of the species has allowed dozens of species of native plants to return. Shouldn't we just give up on invasive species, you may think? If we did, we would end up with fields of garlic mustards and forests of buckthorn and not much else. Lots of people have told me over the years how frustrated they are in trying to bring invasive species under control. But I always tell people to stop and think about what their yards would look like if they didn't keep up. Each garlic mustard plant can produce thousands of seeds. Only a portion of those seeds are going to cause new plants, but stop and do the math. Say 1/10 of 1% of those seeds create new plants. Then each of those surviving plants can create more thousands of seeds. So you see what happens if you don't try to control invasives even a little bit at a time. In addition to vigorous treatment of invasive species year-round, TNC uses prescribed fire to help in the restoration of maintenance of woodlands and prairies, and in this case, in the photo, the wetlands of the Lulu Lake Reserve. Fire historically was a key element in the health of the wetlands, woodlands, and prairies in North America. Prescribed fire helps to remove layers of dead plant material. That removal makes it easier for plants to emerge and also reduces the amount of material that might fuel brush fires. A major component of Lulu Lake is its wetlands. Wetlands are a valuable resource many of us never even notice. Wetlands are nature's flood insurance. They capture, hold, and gradually release rainwater, which helps to avert floodings downstream. They're also important nesting places for species such as sandhill cranes. The sandhill cranes migrate each year to the Mukwonago River from their winter habitat in Florida. And hundreds of plant species also live in healthy wetlands. In 2010, part of the Lulu Lake wetland was in trouble. You can see the dark spots south of the river in the center part of this photo. This was an invasive species of cattail that was spreading out like a carpet, blanketing all of the native species of plants. A contractor hired by the Nature Conservancy has worked for 10 years to bring the invasive species of cattails under control. This contractor came up with an innovative way to take care of the cattails without damaging the native species trying to hang out in the wetland. Here's a view of the treated area today. The hundreds of hours of work over the years have been successful. The wetland now has 100 species of native plants, including some that are rare. Another great success story is the battle against purple loosestrife. This was an aquatic invasive species that is believed to have come to America in the 1800s in the ballast of sailing ships, and then it took off and spread wildly. About 25 years ago, researchers began to study whether it was possible to use a family of tiny beetles that feed on purple loosestrife and keep it under control in Europe. The big fear with biocontrol is always that the solution may become a new problem, one that threatens native species. Years of tests were done and the beetles were approved for release. Where huge swaths of this magenta, these beautiful magenta flowers covered wetlands in the 1990s, we now see only a few scattered purple loosestrife plants. For several years, TNC staff in the Mukwonago River Watershed have raised thousands of purple loosestrife beetles in the spring. These beetles are used to form new permanent beetle colonies in areas where the purple loosestrife is trying to get a foothold. As I said earlier, this has been one of the great success stories in invasive species control. And our wetlands have thrived with the removal of these invasives. Lulu Lake is a gift from the retreat of the glaciers 12,000 years ago. This kettle lake is 95 acres in size, but about 45 feet deep and very cold at the bottom. When the temperatures on the surface are in the upper 70s in midsummer, it can be in the 40s in the bottom of the lake. Another invader came to Lulu Lake a few decades ago. With the help of D. Timothy Gerber, PhD, a biology professor at UW-La Crosse, you can see in the photo here, TNC tackled the invader called Eurasian water milfoil. This plant can grow a couple of dozen feet long and create dense beds that are poor habitat for fish and a nightmare for boaters. Because of the diversity of plant and fish species in Lulu Lake that Sarah talked about, TNC has decided not to use any herbicides as has been done in other lakes. Instead, we decided to remove the milfoil by hand. Dr. Gerber realized early on that if we open the area up by removing the milfoil, we might just open it up so more milfoil can come back. He came up with the idea of using a biodegradable fiber mat as a growing media for native plants that would repopulate the open areas. Cuttings of native plants were woven into the mats, which were then put on the lake bed, and the plants and the native plants took off within a few weeks and took root. Eventually, the fiber mats deteriorate, leaving only native plants. Now I'm going to let Dr. Gerber talk about Eurasian water milfoil, and then I'll be back.
Good afternoon. My name is Tim Gerber. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and I have been working at Lake for a number of years on a project where we are trying to remove exotic aquatic species like Eurasian water milfoil. The plant has roots, as you can see there. It's rooted in sediment, and then it has very long stems, and then it's got a fine leafy or feathery kind of leaf on it. This plant will grow to the surface. It will put on flowering stalks and inflorescence here with flowers on it, and then it can produce seed.
This spring, a pair of ospreys showed up and occupied the platform residence we'd had waiting for them for more than 20 years. That's osprey on the left. They're just a magnificent bird to watch. The pair hung around for a while, brought in huge sticks to furnish their residence, but then they left. We're hoping they return next year and decide to raise a family. Lulu Lake is also a stopover for lots of migrating birds each year, including the loon, as you can see on the right photo, and many other species of waterfowl. Here's a question for you. Can we love a beautiful thing like Lulu Lake too much? Perhaps. It's important for visitors on the water and on the land to realize they can easily damage this fragile environment by littering, by going off designated trails, or by overuse. Although there's only one full-time residence on the lake, summer days can see the lake crowded with dozens of boats that follow the half-mile river upstream from Eagle Spring Lake, where there are about 300 homes. TNC has been working for several years to explain to visiting boaters how to lessen the impact on this fragile environment. A few years ago, the towns of Eagle and Troy helped by enacting ordinances that require boaters to reverse their motors at 2 points in the rivers to slough off any hitchhiking Eurasian water milfoil. It's all there for you. We're open for quiet recreation from dawn till dusk. Quiet recreation means hiking, cross-country skiing, and snowshoeing on some of the 10 miles of trails on the preserves along the Mukwonago River. Just remember to take care to help protect this precious place, and who knows, you might see a badger cross your path. Now I'll turn it over to Brian Miner, who will talk about an essential part of our work. And if I've made you think of a question, then stick around for the question and answer session at the end of this presentation and fire away at us.
Thanks, Jerry. My name is Brian Miner, and I'm a land steward here at Lulu Lake and some of our other preserves in southeastern Wisconsin. As Jerry talked about, restoring Lulu Lake back to the condition it is in today has taken a lot of work. The backbone of that effort has been our many volunteers. In the early 1990s and early 2000s, much of the stewardship on the preserve was done by a group of dedicated volunteers who were part of our stewardship committee. This committee organized and completed stewardship activities like invasive species removal, native plant restoration, and education and outreach. They not only worked on the land, they also advocated for the protection of Lulu Lake and other preserves in the watershed. Today, we continue to have individuals who are dedicated volunteers completing stewardship tasks on the preserve, leading work parties to the general public, or participating on our burn crew. In addition to individuals, we've had help from a number of groups over the past 30 years. Local high school students who have ecology clubs or environmental science classes routinely assist us with stewardship tasks. Some of those include invasive brush removal or digging host plants for the purple loosestrife beetles that Jerry mentioned. We've also had help from state and national level conservation corps, such as the Wisconsin Conservation Corps or the AmeriCorps' National Civilian Community Corps, or NCCC, pictured here. In addition, many of our partner organizations, both within the watershed and around southeastern Wisconsin, have spent hundreds of hours helping out at Lulu Lake. We also have volunteer interns from colleges and universities who study the environment and help us understand the land better. Often these students are able to dig into topics that they've learned in class. For example, we've had students from geography classes inventory tree species and students from soil science classes sample the soils on the preserves. They've applied the skills they learned in the classroom in real-life settings, and the findings that they've come up with have helped inform our management of our preserves. In a typical year, we also have volunteer opportunities for the general public. We host work parties where we do things like brush removal or native seed collecting. We supply all the tools and training needed and only ask that you come with a smile and a willingness to get dirty. When we get back to being able to host these volunteer events, we hope that all of you will join us. Another group that's been really active in stewardship at the Lulu Lake Preserve has been our high school interns. For about 20 years, we've run an internship program for high school students. Most of that time, the students work 2 days a week on our preserves during the summer, including Lulu Lake. In 2017, 18, and 19, we partnered with Milwaukee County Parks and the La Causa Charter School to expand the internship to a full-time summer job. These interns work several days a week at Lulu Lake and the other TNC preserves, and several days a week at the Milwaukee County Park System. The interns have helped with a variety of land management tasks, from hand pulling invasive weeds to installing signs and removing fences. They've also helped with some of the work that Jerry mentioned, like hand pulling Eurasian water milfoil and raising and releasing thousands of the purple loosestrife beetles that help combat the invasive plant. Not only have the interns completed a ton of work on the preserve, they always bring an extra level of energy to our projects. Many of the interns have gone on to careers in conservation, working around the world to protect nature. Many more have gone on to other careers and brought the environmental views they learned here at TNC to other pursuits in life. Earlier, Jerry mentioned a railroad spur which runs through the preserve. Part of the old railroad forms a base for a hiking trail. From this trail, you can get views of the wetlands, oak savannas, prairies, and the lake itself. This is our Legacy Trail, which celebrates past, present, and future Legacy Club members, people who have helped save what they love in Wisconsin or around the world by including the Nature Conservancy in their estate plans or a life income gift. Our work here wouldn't be possible without forward-thinking, generous donors whose gifts help us ensure the ongoing protection and management of places like Lulu Lake. A big thank you to all of our Legacy Club members. You mean the world to us. It's my pleasure to introduce dedicated longtime members, Jerry and Signa Emmerich, who will give an insight to their involvement in the Nature Conservancy and how they think about their conservation legacy.
In terms of legacy, of course, we're certainly interested in seeing this property and the whole Pickerel Lake Fen and Marsh State Natural Area preserved indefinitely into, hopefully into perpetuity. We thought that it'd be, that it was our duty really to preserve what we could and manage it as well as possible, and certainly the Nature Conservancy stepped up big time for us and helped us with that, or we helped them with that mission.
Right, it's kind of always been my ethic, and I think handed down from my mother, that we always try to leave this world a little better than when we came. And so we wanted to make sure that this gem was preserved for as long as we could make it. And we also try to do the same thing in Hawaii, where I'm from, because a lot of the really unique resources there are threatened on a daily basis. And we try to work with or donate to the Nature Conservancy in Hawaii too. And it's very rewarding to see a lot of these precious places, great places, being preserved and safe for the next generations. So I guess that's kind of what been our ethics, our guide for our way of living here.
Thank you, Jerry and Signer, for your incredible support and partnership over the years, and we appreciate you sharing your story with our listeners today. As you can see, there's been an incredible number of people who've been involved with the protection and stewardship of the Lulu Lake Preserve, from volunteers to interns and partners to donors. Thank you all. And now I turn it back over to Sarah.
Thanks, Brian and Jerry, and our special guests for that lovely tour of Lulu Lake. The work we do at the Lulu Lake Preserve to protect the woodlands, prairies, and wetlands not only makes a difference locally on the preserve, but it also ensures that we're playing our part in providing high quality water to the rest of the Mukwonago River system. We also work on other projects that help protect the entire watershed. One of those projects is a groundwater model that can be used as a planning tool to protect groundwater-dependent ecosystems. Groundwater-dependent ecosystems are plant and animal communities that depend on discharges of groundwater to the surface. Some examples of these ecosystems include wetlands called fens that Jerry mentioned earlier in the presentation, and also cold water streams. The groundwater modeling project will help water resource managers to better site future high-capacity wells so that we avoid pumping groundwater that flows to and supports the groundwater-dependent ecosystems in this area. I also want to recognize that we don't do any of our work in this watershed alone. We rely on partners, volunteers, donors, and neighbors to help us protect and preserve the lands and waters in this area. Our partnerships with groups like the Mukwonago River Initiative and our work party volunteers make all of our success possible, and more importantly, they make our work in the watershed more meaningful and fun. Another important partner in the protection of the Lulu Lake Preserve is the Knowles-Nelson Stewardship Program. The program matches private dollars with public investment to conserve natural areas like the Lulu Lake Preserve for future generations. We'd love your help in the coming months speaking up for this important program, which will expire in July 2021 unless it is reauthorized in the next biennial state budget. You can learn more about how stewardship has helped the Nature Conservancy and others protect forests, lakes, rivers, and wetlands in Wisconsin, and how you can help at our website shown here on the screen. We now have time for some questions from the audience, so I'll turn it over to Emily, who will be moderating the question and answer session.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you everybody for your excellent presentations. I know I always learn so much when we do these things. So I am Emily Mills. I am the Media and PR Manager for the Nature Conservancy here in Wisconsin, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to this presentation. We really appreciate that you all turned out for this. We will be making this available. You will get a follow-up email in the coming weeks, so if you want to rewatch this or share the link with others, you'll have a chance to do that. But for now, I encourage you to head on down to the bottom of your screen. There's a little button that says Q&A. And if you have any questions at all for any of our presenters about Lulu Lake or the entire watershed, that whole area, please use that function to submit your questions now, and we will be happy to answer them during this segment. So I'll go ahead and get to the very first question that rolled in as we got going here. And it's a pretty simple one for our land managers. Paul is hoping to go up to Lulu Lake next week and is wondering if there's any color up there yet. So maybe Jerry or Brian.
Brian?
Yeah, so the colors are starting to turn. Some of the walnuts are definitely turning yellow, and I've seen some maples, especially in the area, turning some bright red. So yeah, the colors are starting, and I expect them to get better over the next couple of weeks.
Great, and absolutely, please go visit. This is a great time to go. Next question comes from Patrick, who loved the land acknowledgement of the indigenous people who lived in the area long before European settlers. To that end, is Lulu an indigenous name or not? And if not, how did the lake get its name?
That's always been a mystery. We've tried to figure out on some of the earlier maps from the 1800s, it is spelled capital L, lowercase u, space, and capital L, lowercase u. And we've always had the sense that it was a family name or something. You know, there are obviously lots of indigenous names in the area. Mukwonago, of course, is supposed to mean place of the bear. And we know from stories and that have been handed down that a lot of indigenous people came up this way through the river system to harvest wild rice and mussels. But as far as the name, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's still a mystery to us. We really have never figured out where that name came from.
That's really interesting. A fun mystery. If anybody finds out some information, you should let us know. Thank you, Jerry. And actually, to something you mentioned in that, we did get a question pre-submitted from someone who registered. Don and Pat want to know, why has the lake been, quote unquote, invaded by wild rice? And they say invaded because it sure obstructs fishing.
Huh. Wild rice is a flashy species. You know, I've heard that it goes through a 4-year cycle, and it's always a marker of the health of an environment. If it indicates good health, if you can see wild rice. But the last couple of years, yeah, it's really pushed in on the North Shore, the West Shore, and even on the Southwest Shore. It's fascinating to see it moving in. And yeah, it has established itself a little bit further out, so it makes it a little tougher to fish.
Fair enough. I thought the wild rice was beautiful when I visited, but I'm not a fisher, so can't speak to that. Our next question comes from Bobbin. Where can we obtain trail maps near Lulu Lake, and can you launch a kayak from the lake?
Yeah, I can take this one. So our trail maps are available online on our website. And the best place to launch a kayak is actually at Eagle Springs Lake, which is north of Lulu Lake. There's a public boat launch by the Eagle Springs pub over there. And then you can paddle up the channel right up to Lulu Lake. It's a great paddle. I love paddling the channel, so I highly recommend it.
Great, thank you. All right, Joseph asks, will the soil repair itself after buckthorn roots are removed?
This is something that it takes a number of years because that toxicity remains in the soil for quite a while. But eventually it's going to dissipate, it's going to go away, so just be patient. You know, the native stuff will come back, or if you're planting things, just be patient. It will come back.
Well, that's good to know. All right. Next question is from Jillian. What kind of work do you do to help build buy-in for conservation work with local homeowners and property owners? Someone's got to know the answer to this.
Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, so we try to work with our neighbors as much as possible. We try to get out the word about what we're doing on the preserves, as well as what they can do on their own property if they want to remove invasive species and things like that. One of the things that we work quite closely with the Mukwonago River Initiative that Sarah mentioned. And so MRI, as it's known, does have a homeowner outreach program, and then the Friends of the Mukwonago River also do a lot of outreach. So really it's outreach through our own preserves, and then it's also outreach through other partner organizations.
Great, thank you. And please keep those questions coming. It was great. The next one comes from Steve. Can there be anything done to improve the silt situation at the entry of the Mukwonago River on the west side? It seems to have really filled in during the last few years.
Sarah, can you talk about river flow? I think what's happening there is that the river brings material down and it sort of gets stuck there. I don't know if it has to do with downstream or what, but yet it goes from year to year. Occasionally when we get heavy rains, it'll flush that whole silt situation out.
Yeah, so Jerry pretty much got it there. Rivers are higher energy environments. They have more, the water in them has more power than water in a lake, power to move sediment. So as there's erosion upstream that gets washed into our rivers, they carry that sediment with it until it reaches a lower energy environment like the lake. And then that sediment just settles right out. So that's what's happening. If you look at the formation of a delta, it's the same process. if it wasn't to get washed out, like Jerry said, it would build up, and then the river would continue through that sediment and carve a new channel through it. So really what we need to be thinking about is what we're doing upstream of Lulu Lake, and that can help us reduce over sedimentation into Lulu Lake.
All right, thank you. Cynthia wonders, where did all the sand come from on the North Shore?
Cynthia, because of time, I didn't talk about development on the other side of the lake. There used to be 2 large summer camps over there, and each of them have quite a bit of material that got brought in to make the beaches, basically, and that's where a lot of that stuff came from.
Storied history, for better or for worse. All right. Robert asks, has there been any cooperative discussion with DNR and Town of Troy to control boat access and limit use of the beach on the North Shore for summer parties and human waste in that area?
The Department of Natural Resources is continuing to study, and there's an agreement in place that a toilet, environmentally friendly toilet, will be put in somewhere there off the beach. It was a hard decision to make for everybody involved because it was just another human footprint being introduced. But the idea was that if you can create a trail to this toilet, then you can keep people from wandering elsewhere in the area. And the Department of Natural Resources is continuing to study how best to do this and how to be the least intrusive in doing this.
Sure, thank you. Leslie wonders, are there hiking trails? If yes, how many miles of trails and where is the best entrance?
Yes, we do have hiking trails. We mentioned the Legacy Trail, which is about 1 mile long. There's another trail that runs through the preserve on the old railroad grade. That's about another 1 mile long. So you can access that from our parking lot on Nature Road.
I have been there. I can attest to that. It's a lovely spot. All right. Sorry, what was that?
The trail maps are on our website if you'd like to look at those.
Right. And we will include the links to some of this stuff in the follow-up email that everyone who registered for this will get next week. So if you can't find it on your own, we're happy to help out. Next question from Anonymous. What's the best time of day to visit Lulu Lake? And what has been one of your most interesting or unusual wildlife sightings there? So if everybody wants to take a turn, we'll start with best time of day, you think, and then an unusual wildlife sighting.
There's a very rare species of squirrel called Franklin's ground squirrel. They're distinctive in, if you see one, they sort of run with a hump up on their back. We've worked with researchers over the last 10 or 15 years because they were known to have been at Lulu. And the researchers installed cameras to watch for at night. We once got a very blurry image that we think was a Franklin's ground squirrel, but we couldn't confirm. But we were all sort of hoping that it was still a Franklin's ground squirrel hanging out. Brian, what about you?
Yeah, well, my favorite time of the day to visit the preserve is early in the morning. It's really quiet. You can usually see a little bit more wildlife activity. And then, I don't know that I've seen a whole lot of unusual species, but the sandhill cranes are definitely my favorite species out there. Typically on early summer mornings, you can see them hanging out even just along the trail. There's usually several nests on the preserve, and you can generally get fairly close, and you can get great views, especially if you've got a really good camera. You can get some fantastic photos.
Well, I'll chime in and say I like to go any time of day it's warm enough to jump in the water, because it's really a lake you shouldn't miss experiencing from in it as well as looking at it. And interesting wildlife. There's something that I've only seen at Lulu, and I'm going to need to ask for Jerry's help. It's either a short or long tail weasel.
I think it's the short-tailed weasel.
Short-tailed.
Yeah, they're there. It's fascinating. They're beautiful little animals.
Is that the least weasel by any chance?
I'm not sure if that's the same animal or not. Yeah.
We had someone comment that they said the most interesting wildlife experience at
Right.
Lulu was seeing a least weasel with
I
a dead
saw that.
mouse in its mouth
Yeah.
at the small bridge over the river to the west.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's helpful, but maybe different, same.
Maybe.
That's great. So I think the lesson is that people should definitely go out there, especially early in the morning, with a good camera and some patience, and they'll have some of their own wildlife experiences.
Well, and it's a preserve for all seasons. I mean, you can go there in different seasons, and it can be a very different place from the season you were there before.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. And we'll get to a couple more questions here. You still got a little bit of time to throw a question into the Q&A if you still have one. So we'll go with, let's see, here it is. Elizabeth asks, can you talk a little bit more about the previous retreat center and summer camps at the lake?
Yeah, the Boys Clubs of Milwaukee built the summer camp that was there from the 1960s into the mid-1980s. And they brought lots and lots of kids out of Milwaukee to have a nice experience. And it was quite successful. And I never did hear exactly why they decided to give up the camp and the pharmaceutical company took over. The pharmaceutical company, as I said, started to build this giant concrete structure. And if you were to run a metal detector over some of the hills there, it would really go wild because there's a lot of rebar buried there. But it's a testament to the tenacity of nature that the area where the corporate retreat center had been built is, indistinguishable right now. It has a very healthy prairie on it.
Great, thank you. All right, you mentioned, this is from Bart, you mentioned that buckthorn roots are toxic. Is buckthorn allelopathic?
Yes, Bart, that's a great word, allelopathic.
I had to look it up.
It happens with several of these invasives. There are other ones like spotted knapweed is a nasty little invasive that literally creates deserts. It's so toxic that nothing will grow around it, and all you get is this sandy soil with this species. And yes, buckthorn is allelopathic, and it's a real problem because as I said earlier, you end up having to wait for the soil to cleanse itself for several years.
I definitely learned something new today. Thank you for that. I mean, I learned a lot new today, but that word in particular for sure. All right. Don and Pat would also like to know and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, a lot of marl has formed in the lake, M-A-R-L-E. Does it negatively impact the health of the lake?
No, it's good for it.
What is it?
So marl is a mineral that's got a lot of calcium in it. It's a very fine substance, and usually it settles down to the bottom of our lakes, and its formation is very natural. As our groundwaters come in, they bring in waters with a different mineralogy because they've been flowing through the rocks in the ground and bring little bits of dissolved rocks up with them. And so as temperature changes in the lake, the solubility of those minerals change, and when they reduce, they precipitate out this marl. It's not particularly bad for the lake, and why I said it's good is that it actually can trap nutrients that are in the water in that marl and then settle them out into the bottom so we don't have too many nutrients flowing through our water system. So in some ways it can be very helpful.
Lovely, thank you. All right, so here's a fun recreation question. Someone wonders if we ever host events open to the public, such as hikes or canoe outings at these preserves.
this event was supposed to be an in-person event, and we were going to invite all of you to bring your kayaks and canoes to Lulu, and we would host the day, and then we were going to have a session after that with our state director. And unfortunately, we got COVID. And this is what we're offering in its stead. And hopefully we can have an in-person event next year, and we'll get back to tours and hikes that we host with experts to tell you about the things that they know best.
Yeah, the answer is a yes, absolutely, as soon as we can do it safely again. Thanks for the question. All right, let's see. Cynthia wonders, can you tell us a little bit more about the unusual plants at Lulu?
Brian, do you want to talk about orchids?
Sure, yeah. Lulu has, like we mentioned, there's a lot of different ecosystems at Lulu Lake, from oak savannas and prairies to the wetlands. And even within the wetlands, there's a lot of variation in the wetlands depending on how the groundwater comes in and some other factors. So there are a number of orchids species that live on the preserve. Some of them are harbored in really sort of dark corners of the forest, dark, wet corners of the oak forests in there, and then some of them are right out open in the wetlands. A lot of them are really hard to find because they are short and green, and or they have little inconspicuous flowers. Like the Lake Huron green orchid is actually pretty hard to find because it just sort of blends in. Some, like the lady slippers, are much more showy, and when they're blooming, they're really spectacular. So that we've had an intern this summer who was out looking for some of the orchids, trying to identify the actual locations of the population so that we can study them a little bit better, understand what requirements they need for to thrive out on the preserves, and then hopefully use that as an indication for restoration at other places across southeast Wisconsin.
If you had to pick a favorite orchid.
Ooh, that's a
Put
good
you on the
question.
spot.
Some of the more showy orchids are, of course, generally favorites. I really like noting ladies' tresses. They're relatively simple, but when you look at them really closely, they have some real complexity of the flowers. So I'd say those are my favorite.
There's one that was found at Lulu, several years ago, called the putty root orchid. And it's a beautiful orchid that has a putty colored stem that verges into a lilac color. It's also called the Adam and Eve orchid, which I'm not quite sure I know why that name is applied to it, but it's a beautiful orchid if we can find it.
Fun hunting. Someone actually speculated in the comments that they would like to believe that the lake was named by the call of the loon.
Thanks,
which I
Gail.
like.
That's a great question. And you know what? That might be it.
Forgive me for the name.
Yeah.
That's a bit of speculation.
Oh,
Emily, I think we've lost you. I see one more question from Cynthia. Can you tell me more about the kettles around Lulu and where they formed from glaciers? Yes, as the glaciers retreated, they would leave big, giant ice plugs. So if you look at an aerial view of a lot of southern Wisconsin, you'll see these perfectly round lakes, or even in farm fields, you'll see these perfectly round dark spots. And these are places where when the glacier was retreating 12,000 years ago, these are places where it was a little softer and they left these giant ice plugs. Because you have to remember that 14,000 years ago, if you were standing at Lulu Lake, there would be 1 mile of ice over your head. I mean, that's how thick the ice was. And then as things warmed up, it gradually faded away, and the glaciers started to retreat to the north. and left these ice plugs, and eventually the ice plugs melted. So you have these round lakes that are sort of a conical shape and very deep for their surface size. Hope that answered your question.
I'm glad that that came through, even though I froze for a minute there. I caught it. It was great. Thank you, Jerry.
I saw your face, so I thought I'd pick it up.
No, I really appreciate it. Thanks for running with it. Okay, we're going to do one final question before we wrap things up here. And it looks like David asks, I've noticed on my hikes in the southern Kettle Moraine that there are a lot of thorny raspberry bushes that really crowd out other plants. Are these plants bad for our area?
So I can take that one. So raspberries and some of the other brambles are native to southern Wisconsin. Like a lot of native plants, they respond negatively to fire. So prior to Euro-American settlement in the area, most of southern Wisconsin burned, within a 5-year period, say 1 to 5 years. And so the raspberries tend to respond negatively to fire. So when you burn through them frequently, they don't take over. So in the absence of fire, then we start to see plants like raspberries taking over in some areas. So they're not necessarily bad, but they can be indicative that the land really does need a return to a good fire regime.
Great. Okay, well, we'll wrap up questions with that. Thank you so much to all of you for your great questions, and to all of our panelists for their expertise. If you have any remaining burning questions or think of something after the fact, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and you can also drop us an email at wisconsin@tnc.org. And like I mentioned, we will send out a follow-up email next week that will have links to all of the good stuff we talked about in the presentation, as well as to a way to rewatch or share the video of the presentation on YouTube. But for now, I'd like to hand it back to Sarah to finish us up here.
Great, thanks, Emily. As we draw to a close today, we'd like to remind you about 2 upcoming 60th anniversary events. On October 14th, our Northwoods will celebrate and highlight Wisconsin's Northwoods, including bird life, old growth forests, and conservation. And on November 17th, please join us virtually to learn how planned giving can create a conservation legacy that helps protect our natural resources for years to come. You can find all our upcoming events by visiting our 60th anniversary webpage at nature.org/Wisconsin60. So a poll is about to appear on your screen in a moment. Please help us out and complete that poll and click the submit button before you leave the webinar today. We want to thank you so much for joining us and hope you enjoyed the tour of Lulu Lake, and we look forward to connecting with you again at an upcoming event.